doing? Afternoon. Good. Here's my first question for you all is, who are you all representing? Are y'all City of Austin folks? Raise your hand. City of Austin. Okay, excellent. Are y'all part of the development community? So like, landscape architects, engineers, raise your hand. Great, I think that covers pretty much everyone. So thank y'all for letting me know who I'm speaking to in the room. My name is Jill Amesqua, and I'm the principal planner in Austin Planning's Urban Design Division. And today I'm going to be going over an overview of how to pass the Great Streets Review. 2 weeks ago, I went over an overview of the Great Streets Plan and standards. Today, I will continue to talk to those additional items that I spoke to 2 weeks ago, but I'll also include additional information. So this is a much more detailed presentation. At any point, if you can't hear me, if I'm speaking too fast or not speaking loud enough, please let me know. Just raise your hand and I'll slow down or speak louder. Thanks. So the key takeaways from this presentation include what's listed on the screen here. The first item that we're going to go over is the Great Streets Review process, specifically on the formal side and how to successfully pass a Great Streets Review. The second item is common reasons for application rejection. So basically, the goal of this presentation is how to successfully obtain an approved site plan for Great Streets. And the third item is the initial submittal, the design strategies to avoid rejection comments. So how can we as urban design staff help us to ultimately go through this process as quickly as possible and have the best outcome for the design side as well. And number 4 is to have effective written responses. So we'll go over that more detail in this presentation as well. And the second to last item on this slide is having accurate revisions. So what I'm looking for as leading the design side and the review side for site plan review. And then lastly, we'll talk more about informal review as well. So I went over this 2 weeks ago, but I wanted to present to this group so we're all on the same page, the Great Streets update. So currently, there are 2 things that are part of Great Streets. One is the plan itself that includes a 110-page document that has kind of a high-level like vision for the Great Streets plan. And then there's also a separate document for the standards. So when I talk about Great Streets, the program, that includes both the plan and the standards. And the standards includes things like construction details. So like if you are a reviewer and you're looking to actually implement Great Streets, you would look at the standards for things like bench placement, what that bench actually looks like, for example. So the Great Streets plan, when we talk about the plan standards, it's a 25-year-old plan. So a lot has happened in the last 25 years in relation to technology, different materials are available, there's new street furnishings, and so there's lots of opportunity to potentially remake, not revision or anything, but just tweak the current Great Streets plan and update it for this current century. And then in relation to the downtown density bonus program, so Great Streets is part of this conversation in relation to the downtown density bonus program updates, because Great Streets is a gatekeeper requirement to participate in that program. So next I'm going to go over a recap of this first course, the Great Streets overview. So 2 weeks ago, what we talked about was what is on this map. So I'll point to this here. On this map, what it is showing is 2 things. One is the Great Streets plan that I spoke of, which goes all the way to MLK. On this plan, this north, this is downtown Austin. You know, these are shot at the bottom for the boundaries of the Great Streets plan, as well as 35 all the way to Lamar. And so that is what we're talking about as far as the Great Streets boundaries. However, there is a Great Streets developer reimbursement program that I'll get to here in a later slide, which the boundaries of that is this red box with the central business district and the core of downtown, and that only goes to 11th Street. And there's also additional Great Streets projects that are outside of these boundaries. So down here on Rainy Street, where you don't see that as part of the boundaries. However, there are 2 tall in the towers, the water line, like some of those really tall towers in downtown, and Great Streets is down there as well. So Great Streets is implemented 3 ways. The first is through the downtown density bonus program. So not all, but most of the towers you see in downtown is how Great Streets is actually installed. The second way is through the Great Streets developer reimbursement program. So developers in this area can opt in to Great Streets. The third way is through CIP projects. So like right here on Cesar Chavez, on Second Street, as well as Brazos, those are our 3 CIP projects for great streets. So the required great streets elements and criteria. So what is shown on this slide is, this is our best example of great streets, so, or one of our examples. So it's showing a wide 10-foot pedestrian zone, as well as a 8-foot wide furnishing zone. And that includes things like benches, bike racks, trees, trash receptacles, and lighting that make up the great streets plan. So what is required? So I went over this 2 weeks ago, but I wanted to go over this again in more detail for this group. And on this slide is showing what we need to actually pass a great streets review. So if I'm a reviewer in urban design, and I want to review for great streets, this is the list that I'm looking at. So the first thing on here is benches. And so if you have, let's just say, you have a full property in downtown, is one full block, and on one block face, the first line here is you're gonna need to install 4 benches for that block face. You're also on the same block face, but you need to install 8 bike racks. So this is required for the Great Streets program. And then thirdly, the trash receptacle. So depending on your north-south or east-west facing streets, you will install 1 trash, 1 recycling receptacle. And then street lighting. So there's space 88 feet on center starting at the corner, as well as street trees. So those are every 22 feet on center. And for those are a 5-inch caliber minimum. And they are listed here on the slide as specific tree species for whatever street your development is located on for the street frontage. The only thing that I wanted to point out here again is that Chinkapin oak at the very bottom of this table has been substituted out for the Texas ash. So great streets elements, to dive more into the detail. So what we're talking about again with street trees is having a 5-inch caliber tree that is a really big tree. So that is our minimum requirement for street trees, and that is installed 12 inches above the root wall. So if you have paver grates, it's not from the top of the paver grate, it's from the actual root wall itself. As well as having 11 feet from the center of the tree to the light pole. So what I've seen in downtown is that distance is actually really tight, but that is our standard today. So the soil volume is really important. If you have all of your funds going directly to soil volume as much as you can, that's gonna help out the long-term success of the tree, as well as our standards include only 2 things right now. So you can do tree grates, or you can do paver grates as well. In addition, the benches are grouped in like pairs, or like more in a conversational manner. They're facing each other and perpendicular to the curb. And the bike racks are grouped in groups of 4, and those are also perpendicular to the curb. The trash and recycling receptacles, you can see in this blow down here, those are placed at the corners depending on which way your property faces or what street frontage is located on. The lighting is spaced 88 feet on center, so starting at the corner and going 88 feet from the first light pole in the corner. And again, you have 11 feet between the light poles and the center line of the trees. So the review workflow, so getting into some newer information outside of what we spoke about 2 weeks ago. So the formal city review process includes in tandem with other divisions. So we work with Development Services, Transportation Public Works, Austin Water, Austin Energy, and our sister departments to achieve a successful approved site plan as our ultimate goal. So with that, we review great streets and urban design in the city of Austin. So we're just one of, there's 13 different departments in the city that review for site plans. So we went over this 2 weeks ago. I think this is important to go through again. So starting, like, how does it start internally in the city? So step number 1 for the site plan review process is having intake. Like, the applicant will submit the site plan to the city of Austin through DSD, and that is through the completeness check process. And that is my understanding that urban design has a checkbox on there that says, for purposes of this conversation, are you installing great streets yes or no, and you'll check that box. Please also, if you can, reach out to Urban Design to make sure that we have a heads up that that's coming our way, so we know in our internal review system in Amanda to look for that review as well. Two is the reviewer, so as an urban design, review the site plan, and we make sure that it is compliance with the Great Streetscape standards. From there, every department, all 13 departments has their own review process, reviewing for their code standards. And then we all submit at once our comments on the site plan. And this goes through multiple rounds of review, so internal review, sending it back out to the applicant. They'll find those comments and get back to us until we achieve an approved site plan. So the site plan review comments, so all comments must be addressed through the formal resubmittal. I'll talk more about that here in a subsequent slide. So the applicants should expect several review cycles. I've seen some go up to 6, that includes U0 through U6, as well as design by review. So what I've seen recently is not necessarily blank, but submittals that do not have Great Streets on them. So my expectation moving forward would be to show as much as we can Great Street elements, so that we can have a conversation, maybe that's a phone call, maybe that's an initial pre-submittal meeting where we can talk about how we reach Great Streets compliance initially instead of doing side by review. So how do we avoid delays in the site plan review process? What I'm going to go over next. So in this remainder of the presentation, I will go over how to reduce the number of cycles that are needed for project approval, which is what we're ultimately trying to achieve. So the submittal expectations before you submit, there's 2 slides on this. So the first one talks about right-of-way dimensions. So this is actually pulled from the Great Streets plan, and this includes, it's actually a second street, so it's a very specific example. But this has your right-of-way width would be from the building base to the base of the curve. That's really what we're looking for when I say that. And then there also needs to be a note on the cover that says you're participating, you're doing a downtown density bonus project, of which Great Streets state the requirement to participate in that project. So that's what needs to be on the cover sheet. As well as the installation of the number of streetscape elements. So here you can see trees, there's supposed to be benches and bike racks. I believe there's lighting on here as well. And also call outs. So making sure that you have all these elements labeled accurately. So 2 more on middle expectations before you submit. So looking at the same exact plan set for Second Street and looking at dimensions. So what is the spacing between the trees? You can see there's 22 feet on center is our standard for Great Streets, as well as having like this dimension here, 11 feet between the tree and the light pole in the corner, just making sure all those dimensions are labeled accurately. So common reasons for site plan rejection. First of all, the missing right-of-way and or the pedestrian zone dimensions are not on the site plan, so making sure those are there. As well as missing distances between all Great Streets elements. So lights, trees, benches, bike racks, and other elements as well. And having efficient tree furnishings along each street frontage. So you have 8 bike racks, you've got Great Streets. You have 4 benches remaining Great Streets. As well as missing or incomplete submittal packets. So making sure that you have everything in your initial submittal on a set. As well as conflicts with utilities. So if you know that there's a conflict, most trees downtown have conflicts with utilities, so making sure that that's at least identified where there's a tree and conflict with some underground utility. As well as having missing right-of-way and license agreements. So that is a separate process that needs to happen at the same time as site plan review. So this is an example of a rejected site plan frontage. So this has been redlined just for this presentation. So starting on the left side of your screen, looking at the lack of dimensions of the trees. So you can see spacing between each of those trees. And there's other comments on here of that same nature, as well as the distance that is not shown between the trees and each of those groups, as well as the bike rack. So it's really hard to see, but this number 5 is just calling out to 2 bike racks, or there should actually be 4. And lastly, this is calling out the connection between the tree and the light pole in the corner. That's also not shown. So formal versus informal review. So my preference is to only have formal review, and that is because a number of reasons. So I'll go over the first one. So the first one is the official city review cycles in our Amanda system are all documented, and all departments can see all comments that we're making. 2 is to ensure that all reviewers see the same plan sets, we're all working in tandem with each other at the same level of review. And then 30 is a legal record of comments and responses. So if you use Amanda and you're not using email, everything is documented. So as we have turnover internally in our division and other departments, that's all recorded. On the contrary, informal review, I understand there's meetings, emails that have to happen, but I understand like none of that is documented. Urban design is a really small team. We don't have the capacity to upload every single email that we have in communication about these projects up to Amanda. There's also, this leads to conflicting direction and delays, as well as miscommunication on the informal side. And lastly, it prevents cross-department coordination on design solutions. So if you're working through email, as I just had a turnover in my team, I had a new member start yesterday, the previous member is no longer here, so all that's lost in his email. I don't have access to his email anymore. So we definitely use Amanda. This last bullet, or last section, doesn't apply to urban design because we're urban design. We only do design. We don't have things like easements and tax certificates and other like items that would constitute as informal. So urban design only does formal reviews that are accepted or rejected, and we don't have the informal status because we're only doing design review changes. And the last item on here also speaks to license agreements. That is not an informal update. Like I said, it's a separate review process that happens concurrently with site plans. So the key message here is to only do informal reviews if possible. So how to address comments effectively. The first bullet on here speaks to read each comment carefully and just make sure that you understand the intent of our comments. Internally in urban design, we have a comment library that we pull from and update those comments as we're going through these reviews. And 2 is to write clear and direct responses. So if you're responding to our comments on the design side, make sure that you're writing down fully the whole picture of what your response is, help us out, make this process go faster, as well as updating plans to show the required changes. So if you're making a comment and responding to the comment, make sure that your submitted plans also reflect that. And next is ensuring the updated plan sets are labeled accurately and have those dimensions on there, as well as the submitting clean and complete responses will lead to faster review cycles. And also remember to update the plans for license agreements as well. So you have, I keep saying this, but 2 separate processes happening at the same time. That's one is led through CPW's land management division, the license agreement side, and the other is the site plan. Both of those are updated concurrently. And lastly, if you believe there are utility conflicts and omissions, please note that in your comments. So site plan review coordination. So I already spoke to this a little bit, but our primary departments that we're coordinating with, because we're working in the right of way for great streets, is TPW, so Transportation and Public Works. As I mentioned, Transportation and Public Works Land Management Division. Kathy and Deb do an excellent job of managing the license agreement side, as well as Austin Water and Austin Energy are other sister departments that are working with every single site plan that we review. And this helps us to identify conflicts as early as possible and having those relationships with our sister departments, making sure that we're achieving compliance with great streets. And it also avoids making any changes outside of the formal review process. So pro tips for passing a great streets review include, again, dimensioning everything in the right way. So the sidewalk zones, the distance between your building to the edge of your furnishing zone. So here it would be the space between where your trees are located in the building, as well as the sidewalk zone itself, and also the spacing between all elements. So the spacing again between trees, bike racks, benches, trash receptacle, as well as lighting, and then including that. So it's really helpful. There's a lot of information, as you can see here, in a really small space on a plan set. So including the dimension control plan is really helpful for urban design staff to make sure that all of those dimensions are being met, as well as showing all Great Streets elements on the plan. So more tips for passing a Great Streets review. So in addition, we work with other utility departments, as I mentioned previously, to resolve those conflicts. And specifically, urban design is a little unique in that we're touching not only TPW, Transportation Public Works, but also all the utility departments as well, because our trees need to be installed in the ground at grade. So if you have two trees spaced in this example, 35 feet on center, that's not going to be Great Streets because we have a 100% success rate of actually sometimes we'll move utilities to install the trees for the appropriate Great Streets spacing. Also, this is really important to take nothing away from this presentation. I need you to take away this, to coordinate as early as possible, to make sure that Great Streets has a seat at the table and understand those design challenges early, as well as responding clearly and accurately to comments, and relying exclusively on formal review, as I mentioned, as well as, well, there's three things happening. There's the site plan review process, the license agreement process, and the downtown estate bonus process. So starting each of those as early as possible will set you up for success. So this is a case study. This is 506 West. This is one project that had all 13 departments review the site plan. This is a mid-block project. So there's north is up on the site plan, and there's a property to the north and a property to the south. So I mentioned the Great Street standards speak to a block face. This one's a little different and had to analyze what's already there on the adjacent properties. And one thing that I had the reviewer do was look at lighting. So if you have, you can't see it on this plan, if there's lighting along the street state frontage, how that relates to existing light fixtures. So too far. So this, I showed this 2 weeks ago. This is an example of an installed Great Street project that shows all the furnishings, so your bike racks, benches, trees, lighting, and trash receptacles, as well as the pedestrian zone. Okay, so to wrap up for a Q&A, so the things we went over today include the Great Streets review and how it fits into the overall review process, as well as the most frequent causes of rejection for Great Streets specifically, and how to respond effectively through the comment review process, and why formal review is essential. Do you have any questions for me?
Have a, I know we don't have required administrative submittal standards for site plans, but do you guys have a preferred minimum scale for submittals?
We do not. It just depends on the projects. Like, if you look at this one, like that's a really small project, where if you look at the Independence, like a full block, it's that needs to be, I think, a different scale.
Yeah, multiple sheets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, but no, I've never thought of that from like a scale perspective of what we're actually reviewing for. And I think that's where the dimensions really come into play. I know some reviewers will actually scale it out and actually draw the dimensions to make sure we're so small, we don't have time to measure every single dimension. So it will help us out in the dimension control plan and having all those dimensions at whatever scale, as long as it's listed on the plan. I don't have a preferred scale. That's a great question.
Once you get down to like 1 to 40 or something, that's like, even if you have all the dimensions, stuff gets so messy, so like, yeah.
Correct. I know internally we've talked about like having standards. You know, some design firms like have specific line weights and have details that they use, but that, to my knowledge, that conversation still continuing just to have consistency. So like I said, if we have turnover internally, we know if we're looking at a submitted city of Austin plan, we know the legends, we know specifically what the reporting, all gonna look consistent. We're still working on that. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Could you give an example of how like a license agreement would conflict with Great Streets? Like if the city wants like dedicated license agreement to like a cafe or something, would that mean that cafe would be like exempt from the Great Streets? Because be conflicting with the constraints.
That's a question. When you answer, John.
Oh, again,
Okay.
can you give an example of how, license agreement would conflict with the Great Streets program? Like perhaps if, the city granted a license agreement to a cafe and if like the design of that cafe would mean that you couldn't have trees and benches in that location, like, how would that work?
That's a great question. So for the relationship between Great Street site plan review and license agreement, it's exactly, from our perspective, it's exactly the same for urban design. So ideally, I understand this is not how it works, but you would submit your site plan and then you submit your license agreement around the same time. Because my understanding, the license agreement process takes up to 9 months or more, because as you, someone please correct me if I'm wrong, but as you update the site plan for Great Streets, then you have to make the same changes to the license agreement because they need to match. Site plan is to get a permit, right? Whereas license agreement is to document what is actually happening as far as vertical improvements in the right of way. And it's a legal mechanism to document that, as well as it establishes maintenance as well. So that's really like an overview of how those two processes are exactly the same, but working for different reasons. And then for the, like, one example is kind of Congress. So Congress is a little, different, and that is within, let's go to it. Is within the boundaries of Great Streets, so it is. It's right here, but it's not called out as far as like a cross section in the Great Streets plan. And so we see quite frequently, like you're mentioning, like sidewalk cafes that are brought as only on the license agreement side. We're not talking about a downtown density bonus project. We're talking about like just installing like tables and chairs or some type of improvement in the right of way, which is only through the license agreement process. So we will evaluate from an urban design perspective what is happening with those improvements and making sure that those improvements are meeting our standards. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Certainly, the boundary of all this was tightly defined. Cities expanding north and south. Is there any plans to expand the boundaries of the, or projects that want to do this? How does that work?
That's a good question. So as I mentioned, with Rainy, you can see, as I mentioned down here, there's Great Streets on Rainy, not all the towers, but some of them have Great Streets for the downtown density bonus program, but it's not in the boundaries. So one of the low hanging fruits is to potentially expand the Great Streets boundaries to Rainy. I do also know that there are PUDs throughout, like outside of this boundary, that in their PUD, they'll say, we're doing Great Streets. It's a really difficult conversation because you don't have the right of way that we have for this nice grid in downtown. And so there are elements pulled. I know there's south of the river, there's Great Streets benches, there's some bike racks, there's some trash receptacles that are pulled from Great Streets, but they're not Great Streets projects. So they're just installing the Great Streets elements themselves. So there are ongoing conversations about expanding the boundaries to other areas because it's really complicated with the constrained right-of-way space. You get like East Austin and some areas have even a smaller right-of-way, already so constrained at 80 feet, as well as curb cuts, because downtown there's the nice grid, like I mentioned, with alleys, and that's a little bit easier to install Great Streets, whereas if you get outside of downtown, there's just so many curb cuts that it makes it really challenging to install Great Streets in those areas. Are there any other questions?
So as a follow-up to that, so do y'all get involved in those, or is that just not interest?
Not necessarily in the element discussion. What happens is, like Cat Metro, for example, looks at our standards and they see our trash receptacle and then they use our standards. So there's, that's how just the elements are being pulled. But as far as part of our update process, those elements will each be updated. So they have the opportunity to potentially follow our new standards, but they're not held to great streets like through the downtown density bonus project. So that's really kind of a one-off conversation. As far as the PUDs go, we do sometimes get involved with the conversation, sometimes lends to, oh wait, we can't fit great streets here because of the reasons that I mentioned. And so it's written down as a nice to have, but it's really not feasible outside of downtown, Pittsburgh County. Any other questions? Answer all of them. Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for your time. There's a couple more slides. At the end of this presentation, apologize. Scrolling through. Okay, so I'm over Q&A, so please feel free to reach out. If y'all have any questions, there is my email and phone number. I'd be happy to discuss any of your projects with you or talk through internally more about Great Streets and the updates. And last slide, if y'all could take this survey about how we did today for post-engagement survey, as well as also a link to Land Development Academy and information on our courses. Thank y'all for your time.